Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we've got 60 new cards for Set 4 Awakening of Chakravarti. Now, these cards have all been revealed in the past week or extra few days or so, and interesting enough, we've got new cards for all 5 main nations, and for Dark States, we have yet to see cards that actually support Bruce. So we've got even more cards for Greedon and Baromagnes. Speaking about the latter, I think Baromagnes got the best support of these 16 cards, but you understand that once we're going to tackle each and every single card. So let's start off with Dragon Empire, and for Dragon Empire we've got one generic card and the rest are all going to be Blaze Maiden support or Sealed Blaze Maiden support. And we're going to start off with this grade 2, which is Stealth Dragon Shakugan. And Shakugan has the effect, continues a regular circle. During the battle, this unit attacked a grade 3 or greater unit. This unit gets power plus 5k. It's a 15k attacker, bit conditional, nothing really special. We've seen this many times before, so we can move on to the next card. Then moving forward into the Sealed Blaze Dragon support cards, we've got this grade 1, this 7k base grade 1, which is Sealed Blaze Dragon Ihsita, and Ihsita has the effect, continues a regular circle. During your turn, this unit gets power plus 2k for each card on your Vanguard circle, include arms but not the soul. So basically the cards that are present onto the circle. So this could effectively get an increase of plus 6k, turning it into a 13k booster or attacker. Is it going to be great? Not really. It's not really that amazing. It's also very conditional. So I think it's not going to see actual play, but we have to wait and see until we get the entire package to know how far this card can go and what good the rest of the support cards are actually going to be. Then moving up to the grade 2, we've got Sealed Blaze Dragon Shikshanya, I think, and its ability reads as, although when the unit is placed on a regular circle cost, discard an arms card from your hand, draw a card, and this unit gets power plus 5k until the end of turn. So this is a cycle engine that can become a 15k beater that interacts with your arm cards. I'm not sure if this is going to be very useful because it all comes down to how many arms cards we're going to play and if it could potentially clutter our hand. If that's the case, this could be a nice card to at least remove those bricks from your hand, because you don't want to have the same scenario that happens with Bastion or with Zorga, where your hand is a phantom hand where you might have a lot of cards but not actual shield value. So this could be a nice card that can combat that, but it all comes down to how the final product is going to look like and how the actual deck is going to be played, if this is going to be necessary or not. Then talking about potential cards with no shield value, we also got a grade 3 normal order for this archetype or this ride line, as we've got this order card, Solitary Spiritual Treasure, and its effect reads as, play this with cost Counterblast 2. Choose 2 arms cards from your drop and put them into your hand. I'm gonna assume this is not too great, because Counterblast 2 is quite heavy and getting 2 arms cards from your drop is fine and all, but it's only good if those arms cards are gonna win you the game or they're very powerful and that they discard themselves. We see this with the Sword of the Trial deck that can use this effect and then it immediately retires itself. You can fetch this back, but as seen as the artwork depicts the 2 new arms cards, it might be that both those cards have some type of effect that force you to discard them to get their effect, and this card might interact with them. But unless those cards are very powerful and it warrants the 2 counterblast costs and the fact that you're gonna play this order, I don't really see this going to be any useful anytime soon. And that was also the final card that we got for Dragon Empire this week. So moving along, we've got 2 new cards for Brandgate for the Prison archetype, and we're gonna start off with a normal order, a grade 2 normal order, which is called Aurora Battle Princess Searching Net Great Extraordinary Chase, and its effect is, play this with cost Soul Blast 2, imprison all of your opponent's back row rearguards in your prison. Now, in terms of value, this is actually pretty decent, because usually for 2 soul, you only imprison 2 cards, and in this case, you could potentially get the entire back row, which is a total of 3 rearguards. Now, the only negative downside to this card is that if your opponent has no back row, this card doesn't really do anything, or if they only have 1, it also is not too great. If they have 2, it's decent. If they have 3, it's pretty good. But there's another aspect to this card that might not be as apparent on first glance, and that is the fact that this card can negate resist or pseudo-resist cards like Trickstar. Because this card doesn't choose the rearguards, it just flat out just gets them from the back row. So if the entire back row is filled with Trickstars, which are usually untouchable by the prison mechanic, This card actually allows you to imprison those cards. So this could be a nice counter to that playstyle, or to some extent. So it depends if you have the room to play this and if it's necessary to play this card, but it's a nice thing to have, at least in their arsenal, that might come up or not. Then for the second card that we've got for Brandgate, we've got this grade 3 Aurora Battle Princess Taser Large, and her ability is auto front row rearguard circle. Once a turn, when your opponent's rearguard is placed other than from hand, rest that unit. This is pretty interesting, because of course this is supposed to interact with the prison mechanic where your opponent frees them and immediately rests, so they cannot use them for offensive value, which is similar to the previous grade 2 Tripar, which minus everything with 5k if it's in the front row, which can fulfill the same rule as this. But in this case, it outright just arrest them, which means they can no longer even attack. So if they had big numbers, then the minus 5k might not be as instrumental, whereas this resting does. The issue is, however, it's a once per turn, so your opponent can first call something that isn't really important, it's then forced to go to rest, and then they can do something else. However, saying that, I am not sure if they changed the ruling on the once per turn, where you as a player can decide to activate or not, even if it doesn't have a cost. I'm not too well versed with that ruling. I assume it automatically triggers, and because there's no cost, you have to play it. But there might be something going on here where even the player can still decide to activate it once per turn or not. I'm not too aware of that. If it does, this card can be great in any scenario. If it doesn't, your opponent can potentially play around this. So any judges or anybody that's more familiar with this ruling, just hit down in the comments down below to explain that even further. I will probably pin it if I see an answer to that question. But besides that point, this card also is very generic, because it doesn't specify anything with the prison. It just basically states if something is called other than from hand. So this can also be a defensive tool against any superior call engine, or something that creates tokens, or anything that can superior call units or things other than from hand, which is actually pretty interesting. So this card could see some play outside of the prison archetype itself if its effect is very important in defensive playstyle, but we have to wait and see till future plays or future decks to see if this card is actually going to be useful or not. Then moving on to Cater Sanctuary, we got two new cards which are pretty iffy, and we started with the grade 1, which is Leap Mia, and Leap Mia has the effect, although when this card is discarded from your hand during your turn, cost Soul 1 and call this card to the back row rearguard circle as rest. It's a Chrono Tooth T-Gar. It's basically that. But it also has another effect, which is this rearguard circle. If this unit is stand, this unit gets intercept and can intercept from the back row. This skill is pretty useless, because not only are you going to call it at rest, so you need to wait a turn before it gets standing, but then also on top of that, you cannot even attack and boost with it. And it's also 5k base. So it's effectively just a card that is supposed to get on the field and then intercept with it the following turn to get 5k shield value out of it, which is not really warrant the value of this card. So I don't know how they managed to do this, but they actually made a useless Chrono Tooth T-Gar clone. Whereas any other subsequent clone of Chrono Tooth T-Gar, the Maiden Gear Chronicle, was actually viable. Whereas in this case, I don't really see any use cases of this card to actually run it, because you have probably better cards to play anyways. Then moving up to a grade 2, we've got Knight of Heavenly Flash Ecclesia, and Ecclesia has the effect, on the rearguard circle once a turn, when this unit attacks, if you have another grade 3 unit in the same column as this unit gets grade +1 and power +5k until the end of the turn. So it basically becomes another grade 3, which can potentially be a higher beater than most grade 3s, so could be played in Bastion. But the problem is that it's not a grade 3 anywhere else besides the field. So it doesn't interact with Bastion's drive check skills and some other effects that potentially need to call grade 3s or something like that. But it does interact with specific cards that need to have grade 3s on the field, but it does interact with other cards that need to have specific grade 3s on the field, like Refluke, for example. So this could be a card that allows you to make those cards more consistent without forcing yourself to run an excessive amount of grade 3s in your lineup, which is actually a big plus, because not only is this going to be more shield value in general, which is very important, but it also allows you to play those cards more aggressively in the early game, because it's a grade 2, which means you can call it on grade 2. If you run an excessive amount of grade 3s, you cannot really do anything in the early game. Any Bastion player can probably tell you that's the case. Then moving on to Story Chaos, we've got new cards for Magnolia, but also new cards for Zorga. And we're going to start off with this generic grade 1, which is Floris Petal Latia, which has the effect, continues on Guardian Circle. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 2 or greater, this unit gets shield plus 5k. It's a conditional vanilla card. Nothing really to talk about besides this, so we can immediately move on, as this probably won't see any play. Then if we go to the second card, we see a grade 2 for Magnolia, which is Sylvan Hornbeast Girafina, and Girafina has the ability auto, when its unit is placed on the back row rearguard circle, you may have this unit get power plus 10k until the end of turn. If you do, this unit cannot be moved to other rearguard circles until the end of turn. That restriction doesn't really matter all too much, it's mainly that it can gain 10k power, turning it into 20k beater. This is effectively a free version of the grade 2 of the right line that cost a soul. The only thing is that this is only that powerful once per turn, but that might not be all too much of an issue because you have revival abilities, you have potential bounce effects, so you could get away with running this card if you don't want to waste the soul on an extra power gain, if that power gain is still very important, because this could become a potential 25k beater on its own. Now on top of that, we also got some new order cards, which of course will interact with Zorga, but this order card could also be used in any other deck besides Zorga, as we've got a new grade 2 Blitz order in the likes of consuming the high-grade sake band of its sins. Yeah, that's a mouthful. And its effect is, play this with cost, soul plus 1, draw a card, choose one of your units, and it gets power plus 5k until the end of the battle for each different order card in total in your drop zone and bind zone, increased by the number of different card names. So this is actually really good, because not only allows it you to use it as a cycle card because you discard and you draw a card, but it also gains power, which is effectively shield during the guard step. And in this case, it can easily be 5k shield, as it's very likely in Zorga you have at least one in drop, but it could also very likely be 10k, 15k, or even more. And shield value, or shield cards that have more than 5k shield, is very valuable in Overdress right now because of the limited shield power. And this card being able to potentially be 10, 15, or even more is going to be very useful. But on top of that, this card allows you, while guarding, to not decrease your hand size. And that's very big, because usually when you guard and you stop attacks, your hand size is decreasing. Whereas with this card, it doesn't do that. And on top of that, the interesting aspect of this particular order card is that it also counts Blitz order. So the following turn, if you're going to use this card again, it is automatically going to be 5k more, because now there's also a card with its name in the drop zone as well, or potentially bind zone. So that's actually really useful. And because this card counts drop zone as well as bind zone, it means it can also interact with potentially Magnolia or potentially Flagberg if they're going to run a couple of order cards, which is actually making this card pretty decent and an overall flexible Blitz order, just like Ghost Chase. Now, depending on the scenario and how your deck is going to build, you either want to go for Ghost Chase if you have on Blaze effects, or if you don't really rely on those all too much, you could go for this card. It's actually a pretty decent Blitz order that might actually see some play coming forward, moving forward into set 4. But of course, this isn't the only order card that we've got so far, as we also got a brand new grade 3 normal order, which is Let the Screams Dissolve into the Sound of Rain. Yeah, these names are something else, as this order card has the effect, your opponent chooses one of their rearguards and retires it. You choose up to one card with the same grade as the unit retired by your opponent from your drop and call to the rearguard circle. So this is basically a mini regurgitation of the underworld that's for free. That's actually really good, because this is just free value. As you discard one, your opponent pops one of the units and you get a unit for free on the board. That's a +1 for free, which also removes something on your opponent's side of the field, and you just removed a 0 shield card from your hand, which can also interact with your Alchemy Magic, which can be used again in the drop zone for free. That also, if you run it, sets up for the Blitz sword that we just talked about. So overall, pretty good. The only downside to this card is that your opponent dictates the value of this card, which is usually very bad in card games if your opponent decides the value of your own cards. Now, there is some playability around this depending on when you're gonna fire off this skill, because if your opponent has only a select type of cards to pick from, they might not even have a good choice to make, because if all the units are the same grade, you know what you're gonna get, because you're going to retire something off their field, and sometimes you don't really care. It all just depends on what you get from your drop zone onto the field, and in Zorga's case, those are usually grade 1s and grade 2s. Those are your main targets. You do usually run maybe 1 or 2 grade 3s, just an off chance that your opponent has a grade 3 in the field if you played Regurgitation, and as this is a mini Regurgitation, this basically will then fuel or substitutes for the same plays. It all comes down to the matchup, the playability, as well as the timing of this card, if this card is going to be good or not. Now, of course, in certain instances, you want to retire a specific card, which probably will never be picked by your opponent if it's probably the most important card on the board, but if you go with the mindset that you're not playing this card for specific pinpoint removal, but just pure value, I think this card is actually pretty decent, as it's free value. Now, moving up to the final nation, we saved Dark States for last, because Dark States got the only high rarity card, a double R, which is actually pretty interesting, but they got another card, which is again very good for Baromagnes, which is making Baromagnes look pretty spicy coming out of set 4. But before we're going to talk about that, we first got a generic grade 1 card in the like of Steam Hunter Nanul, and Nanul has the effect, continuous a Vanguard circle. During your turn, if your soul has 5 or more cards, all of your Vanguards get power plus 2k. So this is effectively a 10k booster, but if your Vanguard can restand, you can benefit from the power multiple times. But if this card removes from the field, you lose the power immediately because of a continuous effect. So yeah, not too great. Probably once you play, unless there's some weird interaction that might make this card useful, but I'm very doubtful. Now, moving on to more Greedon support, because we got 2 new Desire Devils, and one of them directly support Greedon. Yes, you heard me right, one of them, not both of them, but you will understand that we're gonna look at the second card, because first off, we've got this grade 3, which is Desire Devil Walzure. And Walzure has the effect, although from Soul, when your avaricious demonic dragon Greedon is placed on the Vanguard circle, cost counterblast 1 and call this card to the Vanguard circle. Does not activate if you write when this card is on the Vanguard circle. Now that might sound weird, because you might think to yourself, now hold on a moment, if I write the Vanguard, then this card is in the soul, so why does it not activate? The reason why it doesn't activate is when you write your Vanguard on the Vanguard circle, the unit underneath is technically speaking not yet part of the soul. Via rulings, it's then moved to the soul, but the timing of the unplaced already happened because you already placed the Vanguard. So the moment this card triggers, this card is technically not part of the soul, thus it doesn't meet the location requirement of the skill. It's a bit confusing, but that's the reason why it works. It's the right skills sequencing that comes to play here. But the main thing about this card is that it's a free plus on the board that allows you to potentially fuel your restanding with Greedon, which is nice, but the problem here is that it costs a counterblast and it needs to be in the soul to actually matter. Because it's a grade 3, you're not guaranteed to have this card in your soul unless you can put it into soul via certain skills. That is possible, but it's not the most consistent ways of doing things. So it's a bit tricky. You need to be lucky to get this thing ready if you want to go this route, because you have other cards that just buff your Vanguard in the first place, and because it costs a counterblast, might also make your plays a bit more heavy in cost wise, because a lot of the things already cost counterblast. So I'm not sure if this is going to make the cut or not, because you have other cards that somewhat do the same thing, but also have more applications than just what this card provides. Now, moving on to the second Desire Devil card, we've got this grade 1, which is Desire Devil Yada, and its effect is auto Vanguard circle. When your Vanguard attacks, if you have 3 or more stand units, cost, retire this unit, soul charge 2, choose up to 1 card with the same name as your Vanguard from your soul, put it on the top of your deck. So this is effectively a +1 on soul because you soul charge 2, but you immediately get 1 out of your soul. The thing about this card is that it's a persona right searcher, but you put it on the top of your deck, thus making your drive checks less effective, which in the case of Greedon isn't all too great because you're reliant on your drive checks to be crits in that scope, so making your Vanguard attacks more devastating or more deadly. This effectively hinders that game plan because now you know at least that 1 drive check isn't going to be a trigger at all. Yes, you have the persona right for next turn, but it means that this turn is going to be less impactful. Now, on top of that, this condition does synergize with Greedon because you usually want to attack with the Vanguard first. But because this card then retires itself, is a bit iffy because that means you are now lowering the amount of standing units, thus negating the potential double restand or extra value you can generate out of your units because you're lowering the units by this effect itself. So it somewhat supports Greedon, but at the same time also doesn't support Greedon. So you might think to yourself, what is the actual use case of this card? Well, in my opinion, this feels like a very good Baromagnes support card. And the reason why I think that it's the case is because of the fact that it soul charges and it puts the persona right target on the top of your deck. Because what this card could do is that if you attack with Baromagnes and you don't have the 15 soul requirement, the moment you attack with your Vanguard Baromagnes skill activates, but also this grade 1. So what you can do is activate this grade 1, get the soul charge 2 card, get the persona right target, put it on top of your deck, then use Baromagnes skill to counter +1, draw the persona right target immediately from the top of your deck, and potentially get the crit and the extra power, and then proceed your turn with whatever you're gonna do. This allows you to basically get the persona right immediately into your hand without sacrificing your drive checks, which still synergize with your Baromagnes plays, and because you get more soul, it also accelerates towards your potential 15 soul count, and in some instances, this could help you to just reach the 10 soul requirement the moment you attack, thus getting the crit and the extra power with Baromagnes. This could be a nice tech for the playstyle as well, which is an interesting mechanic, whereas I feel this card generates and succeeds more in Baromagnes than actually does in Greedon, which is kind of awkward. But talking about things that succeed with Baromagnes, we've got a new double offer Dark Stage, which is this grade 2 Cutting Sword Dance Chegra, and its effect is auto. When its unit is placed on a rigid circle, perform all the effects below according to the number of cards in your soul. 7 or more cost counter +1, and discard a card from your hand, choose a card from your soul, put it into your hand, and soul charge 1. Again, this doesn't minus on soul, which is nice, but it turns your entire soul into an entire toolbox, which is great for a deck like Baromagnes, which just turbos their soul, thus basically turning their deck slowly into a toolbox, which is going to be very important and very powerful. So you could get your persona right targets, you could get your perfect guards, your guard cards like your triggers or whatnot, or potentially a couple pieces that you want to place onto the field if they have an unplaced effect from hand. That's going to be very important. And the great thing about this card is that this card doesn't have the restriction that it needs to be placed from hand. So it interacts with Baromagnes' superior call effect, so you can call it out of the soul and trigger this effect. Now you might think to yourself, that's very cost heavy with your counterblast, but that's where its second part of the effect comes in, because if you have 13 or more soul, all of your front row units get power plus 5k until the end of turn. So this now buffs your entire front row while you're multi-attacking, and seeing as Baromagnes already buffs the units that are going to call out, that's a lot of power. And that turns this unit into a 25k beater on its own. Now you might think to yourself, the grade 1 of the right line is actually better because it becomes a 28k beater. But the thing is, that is just a beater and doesn't really do anything else. Whereas this grade 2 turns your entire soul into a toolbox. But more importantly, it also buffs the other units. It gives your Vanguard plus 5k, and it gives the other units on the other side also plus 5k. So let's say, for example, you call 2 of these grade 2s. Now those grade 2s both each gonna be 30k beaters, but your Vanguard is gonna be an extra 10k on top of the 10k that it gives itself. So now the Vanguard is also gonna be more powerful and more deadly. And if your Persona wrote, then you have another 10k on the entire front row. So this is a very flexible card that I can definitely see being played in Baromagnes, potentially as a 4-off or maybe as a tech choice, as you don't necessarily have to max out on this card, but it's a very good card to have nonetheless. And that's also all the cards that I wanted to talk about today. Now, this was quite a long video and there were more cards than I usually talk about because I also had more cards than just this week, as well as also a couple of cards from last week that I didn't really discuss on their own because those were the more uneventful cards that we talked about in this video, and it doesn't really make a good video by itself. But more importantly, we did see a lot of interesting, powerful Dark Stage cards that don't support Bruce. Now you might think to yourself, Bruce Road is actually listening to us. They are giving Bruce less support. I'm not necessarily thinking that's the case, because usually with these card games and the companies the companies that are running them, they are in most instances working a couple of months ahead, or a couple of sets, or at least one set ahead. So I assume set 4 was already built and made, and probably in a testing phase the moment set 3 started to be released or revealed with the cards that were in that particular set. So the changes and the things and the impacts of the outrage, probably we will effectively gonna see them in set 5 and onwards, but they might have changed certain things in set 4 already. But that's just a guessing game. But that said, I'm very curious what you guys think of these cards. So let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of these new cards. Are you excited for some of these new options for the respective nation? For me personally, I really like the order cards that we got for Stoicheia. They're looking pretty interesting and pretty unique. So I'm very curious of how those are going to impact and interact with the current builds for Zorga as well as potentially Magnolia. So let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of these support cards. And as always, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over patreon.com/FingTheInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/FingTheInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and see you guys in the next one!